This part is entitled Model 2, the Corrective Provision or Deficiency Compensation Perspective of Self-Psychology and Other Deficit Theories, again like Michael Balint, who writes about the area of the basic fault. Others do as well. Model 2. Corrective Provision Model, Deficiency Compensation Model. The Model 2 empathic therapist provides the holding and the being met that were not provided consistently and reliably by the parent. And so let me just say, in Model 2, the empathic therapist, I've been emphasizing that the more active therapeutic action in Model 2 is the grieving of optimal disillusionment. But again, the disillusionment or the disappointment is against the backdrop of a wonderfully empathic attunement to where the patient's at. So in Model 2, we're not just ever busy facilitating the patient's grieving. We're also busy laying the groundwork by way of being empathically attuned. Remember, decentering from our own subjectivity, joining alongside the patient, taking on their experience, but only as if it were our own. So we enter into their experience, take it on as if it were our own, and resonate empathically with it. And let me also just throw in a little something here. The word empathy gets thrown around by all sorts of people. It gets confused, I think, sometimes with authenticity, which, as you know, I think has to do with allowing the patient's experience to enter into you and you take it on as your own. All right, but above and beyond that, their distinction that I make and that others make, although others don't make it, is the concept of empathy as sometimes involving how it is that we listen. So afferent, AFF, what comes to us, how it is that we listen. We listen empathically. And sometimes empathic means how we respond, efferent, EFF. So we responded empathically. And so empathy can sort of mean either afferent or efferent, how we listen or how we respond. All right, so anyway, so the Model 2 empathic therapist, this is backdrop, provides the holding and the being met that were not provided consistently and reliably. Those are important words by the parent. Sometimes it was provided, but not perhaps consistently and reliably enough such that it was traumatically devastating for the little one, and so therefore they did not internalize the good. They did not do transmuting internalization. So we now, in the context of the treatment, backdrop Model 2, we provide the holding and the being met that was not provided consistently and reliably early on. And this reparation, this is the power of the transference, functions as a symbolic corrective for the early on deprivation and neglect, the errors of omission, the early on failures in environmental provision. As previously noted, although some Model 2 theorists believe that it is this experience of gratification itself that is compensatory and ultimately healing. So many therapists intuitively just kind of think, well, just give, empathic, love, provide, and that'll do it. That'll fill in the deficits. I think that's critically important as backdrop, and every now and then you get lucky. You give the patient something they'd never had consistently and reliably before, and they say, oh my God, thank you, and they're able to take it in. But for the most part, patients are conflicted about experiencing new good, in part because of some Model 3 stuff, whereby internal charged toxic boluses sort of kick in, get delivered into the relationship, and then sort of contaminate and muddy the waters a bit. Okay, but there are some Model 2 theorists who believe that it's the experience of gratification itself that is compensatory and ultimately healing. Most, however, believe that it is the optimal stress created by the experience of frustration against a backdrop of gratification. In other words, frustration or disillusionment properly grieved, optimal disillusionment, that most reliably promotes structural growth and development of adaptive capacity, and more particularly in the form of acceptance, sober, mature acceptance. And also, with the adaptive internalizations of self-object and parenting and psychological functions, that then enables the person no longer to need the input from the outside, no longer to need environmental provision. And therefore, they are now able to accept the reality of who the object in the here and now, or in the there and then, really is. Okay. After all, if there is no thwarting of desire, say the folks who believe, as I do, in the power of optimal disillusionment, optimal stress, optimal frustration, if there is no thwarting of desire, then there will be nothing that needs to be mastered, and therefore no impetus for adaptive transmuting internalization. In other words, grieving the thwarting of desire, optimal disillusionment, will enable the patient to accept the reality that she will never be able to have all that she should have had as a child, and for which she has spent a lifetime searching, thus the relentless pursuit, but that what she has is good enough. So that's the acceptance, evolving ultimately by way of these cycles of illusion, disillusionment, grieving that, illusion, disillusionment, grieving that, evolving ultimately from relentless pursuit of what can never be, but what should have been early on, more reliably and more consistently, to accepting that what she has and what is out there is good enough. Grieving. What is grieving? Mourning, same thing. I call it grieving, but mourning could work as well. It's a protracted process that transforms the patient's refusal to confront the reality of the objects, usually the object of one's desire. It's actually a loved, hated object, but we'll get more into that when we talk about Fairbairn. But anyway, the reality of the objects, limitations, separateness, and immutability, which fuels the relentlessness, of course, with which she pursues it. Again, relentless hope being a refusal to confront and grieve painful realities. Protracted that transforms the patient's refusal to confront the reality of the object's limitations into the capacity to tolerate and accept those disappointing, disillusioning realities. In the context of the treatment, then, as we know, it involves working through optimal disillusionment. That is, positive transference disrupted. In other words, the experience of good become bad, illusion become disillusioning or disillusionment. By confronting the pain of her grief and adaptively internalizing the good that had been prior to the disruption. Now I want to highlight, I will tend to emphasize, because it tends to be more experienced near for the patient, the pain of their grief. But let me say that absolutely in grieving, there is also rage, fury, anger, upset, devastation, pain, heartbreak. But I want to make an important distinction here between raging and being really angry and really upset, which is part of grieving, and outrage. So the distinction between rage, which is more pure, and outrage, which sort of suggests more the sense of frustrated entitlement. By golly, as you pound your chest and say, by golly, it's not fair, it's not fair. And that's not really grieving. That's still holding on to the hope that maybe somehow, if you can complain enough and be outraged enough, that ultimately you'll be able to extract the goodies, the environmental provision, the narcissistic supplies from the object. So outrage, no. But part of grieving will be pain, upset, anger, frustration, maybe fury, but at the end of the day, it does, from my point of view, as I've discovered it with my patients and for myself in my own treatment, it really was more the pain of the grief, and as part and parcel of that, adaptively internalizing the good that had been prior to the disruption. In essence, if you can't always count on external provision, then best that you internalize whatever good supplies you can so that they will always be there for you as internal resources. And that's the adaptive piece of it. If you can't always count on it being there on the outside, then by golly, you might as well internalize whatever good there was and is, so that you can at least know that you can count on it as an internal resource, an internal reserve. Arriving ultimately at a place of serene acceptance, forgiveness, and inner peace as you relent. So instead of the relentless hope, you back off. You evolve to a place of serene, mature, sober acceptance and forgive. You back off, you relent, and in the process, inner peace. Grieving, genuine grieving, requires of us that, at least for periods of time, we be fully present, so you can't be dissociated. So grieving, genuine grieving, for it to be effective in working through optimal disillusionment and ultimately coming to terms with and making your peace with the loss. It requires of us that we be fully present with the anguish of our grief, the pain of our regret, and the intensity of the rage, not outrage, rage we experience when confronted with sobering realities about ourselves, our relationships, and our world. We must not absent ourselves from our grief. I mean, we can, but then we're not going to be effectively grieving. We must enter into our grief and embrace it. And obviously, so much easier if we can do this in the presence of someone who is holding us figuratively. We cannot effectively grieve when we are dissociated, MIA, missing in action, or fleeing the scene. We need to be engaged in the moment, mindful of all that is going on inside of us, grounded, focused, and in the here and now. But if we are in denial, closed, shut down, numb, refusing to feel or protesting the unfairness of it all, then no real grieving can be done. So if we're caught up in our grievances and our outrage and our frustrated entitlement, that's not grieving. Grieving is when you really confront the reality that it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Grief, said Roberta Beckman, and I think others as well, grief is nature's way of healing a broken heart. A lot of people intuitively wouldn't sort of guess that. So they're like, well, you don't want to grieve. But if you don't grieve, then you can be stuck with stuff like depression and other such. But it's in grieving that you can then be and the releasing of the pain that you can then be less depressed. Okay, I wanted to present one of my own clinical consultations that I did on a patient. In fact, and I will make this vignette available elsewhere. I don't have it on the slides, but I will make it to you, make it available to you if you would like. So I present now one of the most heart-rending consultations I have ever done. It's a story about Alicia, who came to see me many years ago because she was haunted by a tragic event that had occurred half a century earlier, 50 years earlier. Alicia presented as a strikingly attractive, elegantly refined, and immaculately dressed 58-year-old woman who held herself with grace and dignity. By dint of her razor-sharp intelligence and extraordinary hard work, she had established herself in a highly successful career, but had no life partner and no family, and suffered from multiple health problems, most notably malignant hypertension. At the age of 7, Alicia had been involved in a horrific accident. She had been vacationing with her family at their summer cottage and was out slalom water skiing on the lake. In the water ahead and to the right, she had seen something breaking the surface. Was it a rock, the end of a log, a clump of seaweed? She couldn't quite make out what it was. Next thing she knew, she had run over it. Tragically, it had been a little boy out swimming, whom she had decapitated with her ski, instantaneously killing him. Alicia had been 7 at the time, as you know, had then spent every single day of the next 5 decades brutally punishing herself, racked with guilt haunted by her shame, her blood pressure inching up year after year. She couldn't live with the knowing that she had done what she had. Every one of the many therapists with whom she had consulted over the course of those years had done their best to reassure her, telling her that she had not been at fault. How could she have known? My God, she had been only 7 at the time, a mere child. It was an accident. She had not tried to kill the little boy. She had to forgive herself. But in her heart of hearts, Alicia knew that, although she had been only 7 at the time, she was an experienced water skier, and, had she chosen to do so, she could have steered clear of and thereby avoided that mysterious object in the water. And so Alicia had spent a lifetime wrestling with her shameful secret, her inner demons, and her intense self-loathing. The knowing that she had been responsible for the death of that little boy, who, as it happened, lived only several doors down from her family's cottage and had been her friend. As I listened, my heart was breaking, for this devastated, broken, guilt-ridden, tormented soul who lived every single day of her life with unspeakable grief and unbearable pain. I said very little as her story unfolded, but with hand on my heart and tears in my eyes, I nodded my understanding. The horror of it, her decades of guilt, shame, private grief, and relentless self-punishment. When I finally spoke, I said, softly, that I got it, why she felt responsible for his death. I told her I understood why she was having such trouble forgiving herself, such trouble figuring out a way to live with herself, what with her knowing that she could have chosen to do something different, but that she had not. I went on to say that it broke my heart to think that she had had to carry inside of her all these years her crippling guilt, her secret shame, and her unrelenting grief. And then Alicia began to reveal more and more of the horrific and incriminating details about what had actually happened that fateful summer day on the lake. That as she had approached the object in the water ahead of her and to the right, she had found herself wanting to know what exactly it was. She, always one for a challenge, had decided to test her skills as a slalom water skier by seeing how close she could get to the object without actually running it over. And so, even when she had gotten close enough to see that the thing in the water ahead of her was moving and possibly alive, and even with her knowing that she could and should veer away from it, she, as if driven by some uncontrollable inner compulsion, had made a split-second decision to jump the wake, again it was a slalom ski, just one ski, behind the boat so that she could get closer to it, instead of staying inside the wake and carefully steering clear of that unknown object bobbing in the water ahead. While Alicia, with unflinching honesty and raw vulnerability, was recounting these more specific and revealing details, I sat very still, barely moving, barely breathing, just quietly taking it in and occasionally nodding. I knew that it was for me to be able simply to listen, to be present, to be there to help her bear the pain of it, the horror of it, the guilt of it, the shame of it, and not to withdraw, not to recoil in horror. It was for me simply to listen with compassion and without judgment. Alicia alternately wept, raged, wailed, howled, fell silent. Decades of pent-up anguish, heartbreak, guilt, shame, fear, anger, torment, despair, loneliness, isolation, regret, and high blood pressure. My heart was breaking for that spirited little girl Alicia had once been, and the solemnly dignified but privately broken woman who now sat before me, surrendering at last her long-held secret guilt and searing shame. Alicia explained that she had robotically recounted her story to many over the course of the years, but that it had always been an abridged version. She said she had held back for fear that people would not be able to bear the horror of it, that they would offer her pat reassurances that would make her feel even more misunderstood, disconnected, isolated, alone, and alienated. As she wept, sobbed, and wailed, she and I both knew that she was releasing at long last the reservoir of tears, pain, heartbreak, and anguish that had been accumulating inside of her for decades. She had so needed to be able to tell her truth, and she had finally found someone who was willing to listen and to bear witness. At the end of Alicia's harrowing narrative, exhausted from the effort of remembering, but visibly relaxing as she revealed the devastatingly painful details blow by blow, she said she suddenly felt a tremendous rush of relief at having shared finally what had really happened those years earlier. A wondrous release followed by an exhilarating inner calm, sense of gentle peace and serene acceptance. Alicia said she no longer felt quite as alone, because now someone else knew the real story and the incriminating details about what she had never before dared to share with anyone. Now someone else knew the truth about what had happened that day on the lake. And then Alicia was done. And although she came back to see me a number of additional times, at the end of the 10th session, she said she was ready to go. I told her she would always be welcome to return were she ever to want to. She said that meant a great deal to her. At the end of our last session, as Alicia was leaving, she lingered at the door for a moment to give me a heartfelt hug. Alicia did not ever come back, but in the interim has referred me at least 15 of her friends and colleagues, and periodically she will drop me a little note reiterating her gratitude that I was able to bear the horror of what she had done, and in that way had helped her to make her peace with the crime that she knew she had committed, albeit with no malice or ill intent, those 50 years earlier. And in one of her notes, she told me with much pride about the nonprofit organization that she had set up shortly after we met to help people who had survived the tragic loss of a loved one to deal with their heartbreak and grief. There also came a time when she informed me that her malignant hypertension was now gone and that her blood pressure had returned to normal. I think of Alicia often and of how she was finally able, with incredible courage and integrity, to confront and grieve the haunting reality of her past, which allowed her not only to evolve to a place of self-forgiveness, humble acceptance, and inner peace, but also to channel all that now freed up energy into the creation of her nonprofit. I believe that in Alicia's case, an important part of what enabled her to find absolution was the opportunity she had to confess to someone who listened with compassion and without judgment, to someone who was able to be present with her as she dared to remember, dared to confront, dared to relive, and finally dared to relent and to forgive herself. In truth, the serenity prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference, is very apt here. I had always mistakenly and probably naively assumed that the Serenity Prayer spoke primarily to the importance of our capacity to accept disappointing realities about the people in our world and to relinquish our relentless hope with respect to them. I had, again rather naively I think and misguidedly, not fully appreciated that perhaps equally relevant is the importance of our capacity to accept disappointing realities about ourselves. Thank you for listening. As a result of genuine grieving, relentlessness and grievances, unmourned disappointments, will become transformed into the healthy capacity to accept the sobering reality that we cannot make the people in our world change, nor can we make ourselves change. We evolve ultimately to a place of accepting that the people in our world are good enough and that we too are ultimately good enough. So the sobering reality that we cannot make the people in our world change, but that we can and must take ownership of and responsibility for all that we can change within ourselves. And the last slide in this part. By the same token, we must come to terms with the sobering reality that we cannot change our history, but that we can and must change how we position ourselves in relation to it. And I'll be saying a little more about that later.